We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Castle of Glass. Flynn Mercer stepped out of the shower, wiping steam from the bathroom mirror. 42 years have been kind to him. His exercise regimen maintained his broad shoulders and strong jawline, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. 20 years as a structural engineer and restoration specialist had made him one of Phoenix's most sought-after experts in historical building preservation. He wrapped a towel around his waist and glanced at his watch on the counter. It was already 7:30 a.m., and he had a meeting at 9 with the city's historical society about restoring the century-old Hawthorne Theater downtown. Flynn had fought for months to prevent developers from demolishing the architectural landmark, and yesterday, he'd finally won. Walking into the bedroom, he found his wife Nora's side of the bed empty. Strange. She usually slept in on Tuesdays when her shift at the hospital didn't start until noon. Nora had worked as a nurse anesthetist for 15 years, having met Flynn when he'd broken his leg in a rock-climbing accident. Her calm demeanor during his panic had captivated him, and they'd been married within 2 years. Downstairs, Flynn found their son, Liam, hunched over a bowl of cereal, one hand scrolling through his phone. At 16, Liam had his mother's amber eyes and Flynn's stubborn chin. The boy glanced up briefly. "Dad, can I use your car tonight? Drama club's running late, and Mom said she can't pick me up." Flynn paused midway through pouring his coffee. "Where is your mother, anyway?" Liam shrugged, said something about picking up groceries before work. That seemed odd. Nora never shopped in the morning. Flynn grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl. "You can use my Audi, but only if your calculus grade improves. Mr. Sandoval emailed me yesterday." Liam groaned. "That's not fair. I only missed one assignment." "Life isn't fair," Flynn said, biting into the apple. "Success comes from consistency, not excuses." Flynn's phone buzzed with a message from his business partner, Weston Hargrove. Client meeting moved up. "Need you here at 8:30. Flynn had met Weston 15 years ago when they were competitors bidding on the same historical courthouse restoration. Instead of undercutting each other, they teamed up and formed Cornerstone Restoration and Engineering. The partnership had made both men wealthy, with projects spanning across 5 states. "About to run," Flynn told Liam. "We'll talk about the car later." As Flynn grabbed his keys, he noticed Nora's purse still on the counter. Stranger still. She never left without it. Something felt off, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Later that day, as Flynn presented his preservation plans to the Historical Society board, his phone kept vibrating. He ignored it until the meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations. Checking his phone in the hallway, he found 5 missed calls from Nora, which was unusual. She knew better than to call repeatedly during important meetings. When he called back, her voice sounded strange, tight and higher than normal. "Flynn, I need you to come to Memorial Hospital." His stomach dropped. "Are you okay? Is it Liam?" No. I mean, yes, it's about Liam, but she faltered. "Just come to the emergency department. I'm here with Detective Michaels." "Detective?" Flynn's voice echoed in the marble hallway. "What's going on?" "It's your car, Flynn. There's been an accident." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. "Is Liam hurt?" "Nora, tell me." "He's fine. Just come now." Flynn broke every speed limit getting to Memorial Hospital. The emergency department buzzed with activity, but he spotted Nora immediately, her copper hair pulled back in a messy bun, still wearing scrubs. Beside her stood a stocky black woman in a blazer, presumably Detective Michaels, and beyond them, sitting on a plastic chair with handcuffed wrists, was Liam. "What the hell is happening?" Flynn demanded. Detective Michaels stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Detective Alicia Michaels. Your son was arrested following a hit-and-run accident involving your vehicle." Flynn looked at Liam, whose face was pale and tear-streaked. "I didn't do it, Dad. I swear I didn't." Detective Michaels continued. "According to your wife, Liam took your keys without permission and drove your car without a license. He collided with a parked vehicle on Saguaro Lane and fled the scene." Flynn's gaze swung to Nora, whose eyes wouldn't meet his. "Is this true?" I saw him take your keys from the counter this morning, Nora said, her voice flat. I told him not to, but he wouldn't listen. That's a lie, Liam shouted, rising from his chair until a uniformed officer pushed him back down. Mom, why are you saying this? Flynn's mind raced. This made no sense. Liam had been at school all day, and the boy was many things, stubborn, occasionally lazy, but never a liar or a thief. There must be some mistake, Flynn said. Liam was at school. His teachers can confirm. The accident occurred at 10:23 a.m. Detective Michaels interrupted. Your son's school reports him absent from second period, which started at 9:45. Flynn looked at Liam, whose expression had shifted from desperation to betrayal as he stared at his mother. Something wasn't right. Flynn had known his son for 16 years, had taught him integrity when the world offered easier paths. I want to speak to my son alone, Flynn said firmly. Detective Michaels hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. When they were relatively private, Flynn crouched beside Liam. Tell me the truth. All of it. Liam's voice trembled. I was at school, Dad. I've been working on the stage design for the spring play during second period. Mr. Riker gave me permission. I wasn't even marked absent. I was there. Flynn studied his son's eyes and saw nothing but truth. Then why would your mother say otherwise? Liam's face crumpled. I don't know. She's been acting weird for months. Always on her phone, staying late at work. He lowered his voice. Last week, I heard her on the phone with someone. She sounded different, laughing in a way she doesn't with us anymore. A cold feeling settled in Flynn's chest. I believe you, he said firmly. We'll figure this out. When Detective Michaels returned, Flynn requested to see the evidence. She showed him photos of his damaged Audi and the other vehicle. The witness who called it in mentioned a teenage boy behind the wheel, Detective Michaels explained. Did they actually see the driver's face? Flynn asked. The detective hesitated. They noticed someone young-looking with dark hair. When we ran the plates and contacted your wife, she confirmed your son had taken the car. Flynn turned to Nora. Are you calling me a liar? Your own wife? She suddenly shouted, her face flushing. Why would I make this up? Our son made a mistake. He needs to face consequences. The outburst struck Flynn as performative. In 15 years of marriage, he'd never seen Nora lose control like this in public. As a medical professional who handled life-or-death situations daily, she prided herself on remaining calm. I'm posting bail for my son, Flynn stated firmly. And then we're going to get to the bottom of this. Chapter 2. Undercurrents. Flynn stood in the kitchen of their modernist home in North Phoenix, a glass of whiskey untouched on the counter. After posting bail, he'd brought Liam home, where the boy retreated to his room, shell-shocked by his mother's betrayal. Nora hadn't returned from her shift yet, giving Flynn time to think. Their marriage had been solid for years, built on mutual respect and shared values. But lately, subtle changes had accumulated. Nora's late nights, canceled dinner plans, emotional distance. Flynn had attributed it to work stress, but Liam's revelation about secret phone calls painted a different picture. The security system chimed as the front door opened. Nora entered, placing her hospital badge on the console table. Seeing Flynn, she paused. How could you do that to our son? Flynn asked quietly. Nora's posture stiffened. He broke the law, Flynn. I won't coddle him. Stop lying, Flynn said, his voice dangerously calm. Liam has an alibi. His drama teacher confirmed he was at school during the accident. Color drained from Nora's face before anger replaced it. Are you calling me a liar? Your own wife. The repeated phrase struck Flynn as rehearsed. He stepped closer. I'm giving you one chance to tell me the truth. The truth is our son is becoming irresponsible, and you enable him. Nora snapped. I'm trying to teach him consequences. Flynn studied his wife of 15 years, the woman who'd nursed him through his recovery, who'd held his hand through his father's funeral, who'd given birth to their son. Now she stood before him, a stranger wearing his wife's face. Who is he? Flynn asked softly. Nora flinched as if struck. What? The man you're seeing. Who is he? You're being ridiculous. Nora scoffed, but her hand trembled as she pushed hair from her face. I work 80 hours a week saving lives while you obsess over old buildings. Maybe if you paid attention to your family instead of cornices and flying buttresses, you'd see what's happening under your own roof. The deflection was skilled. Attacking his passion for historical preservation had always been her go-to during arguments. But Flynn remained focused. I saw our son handcuffed today for something he didn't do, Flynn said. So either you're protecting someone or you crash my car yourself. Nora's expression hardened. I'm going to bed. We'll discuss your paranoid accusations when you're sober. Flynn didn't follow her upstairs. Instead, he went to his home office and opened his laptop. The house's security system had been installed 3 months ago after a break-in attempt. It included cameras covering the driveway, front door, and backyard. Flynn accessed the system and scrolled back to that morning. At 10:05 a.m., his Audi backed out of the driveway. The angle made it impossible to see the driver clearly, but the timestamp aligned with the accident. Unable to glean more information, Flynn closed the laptop. Tomorrow, he would speak with their neighbor, Ruth Benson, an 80-year-old retired teacher who missed nothing on their street. If anyone had seen something unusual, it would be Ruth. Morning came with Nora already gone, her side of the bed cold. Flynn called Liam's school to ensure he could return, explaining the charges would be dropped. Then he visited Ruth, whose porch overlooked their driveway. "Oh, I certainly saw your wife leave yesterday morning," Ruth confirmed, pouring Flynn tea. "Not in her car, though. She got into a silver Tesla. Very flashy vehicle." Flynn frowned. "A Tesla? Are you sure?" "Positive. I noticed because the gentleman driving it has been picking her up quite regularly when you're at work. Handsome fellow, though his car is a bit ostentatious for my taste." Flynn's hands tightened around the teacup. "How long has this been happening?" Ruth looked uncomfortable. "I don't want to meddle, dear, but since you're asking, at least 3 months. Always the same routine. He parks down the street. She walks to meet him. Yesterday was different, though. She came back driving your car around noon, looking, well, not herself." Flynn thanked Ruth and returned home, his mind racing. The security footage showed his Audi leaving at 10:05 a.m., and the accident occurred at 10:23 a.m. But who was driving? And why blame Liam? The answer began to materialize when Flynn examined his car, now parked in their garage with damage to the front bumper. Inside, he found a hospital parking stub from yesterday morning. And wedged between the passenger seat and center console was a silver cufflink engraved with the initials BM. Flynn didn't recognize the initials, but he knew someone who might. He called Weston. "Bryce Madigan," Weston said immediately. "He's the new administrator at Memorial. I met him at that fundraiser last month, the one Nora attended with you." Flynn remembered the event. Nora had been animated that evening, more engaged than she'd been in months. He'd been pleased to see her enjoying herself, not realizing she was performing for another man. "What do you know about him?" Flynn asked. Weston hesitated. "He's divorced, ambitious. Recently moved from Chicago after some scandal. Nothing confirmed, just rumors." "What?" Flynn didn't elaborate. After hanging up, he searched for Bryce Madigan online. The hospital administrator had a polished LinkedIn profile and sparse social media presence. Flynn found a photo from the hospital fundraiser, and there was Nora in the background, her eyes fixed on Madigan while Flynn spoke with the donor. The pieces were falling into place, but one question remained. Why frame Liam? A simple accident wouldn't warrant such an extreme measure. That evening, Flynn waited for Nora in the living room. When she arrived, he watched her carefully, the slight flinch when she saw him, the way her eyes darted to the stairs, hoping to avoid confrontation. "We need to talk," Flynn said. Nora sighed theatrically. "Can it wait? I've had a brutal shift." "No, it can't." Flynn stood. "I know about Bryce Madigan." The color drained from Nora's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Silver Tesla. Hospital administrator. The man you've been sleeping with for 3 months." Flynn's voice remained even. "The man who was driving when you crashed my car." Nora's composure cracked. "You're spying on me now?" "You framed our son," Flynn countered. "Made him spend a night in juvenile detention for something you did." "Why, Nora?" Was the affair not destructive enough? Tears filled Nora's eyes. Whether genuine or tactical, Flynn couldn't tell anymore. "It was an accident," she whispered. "Bryce picked me up early. We had a few drinks at his place. Then I remembered I had to get something from home. He offered to drive me in your car, Because he didn't want to park his Tesla in the driveway. So you let him drive my car drunk? Then blamed our son when he crashed it. Bryce panicked. Nora said, he's up for promotion. A DUI would ruin everything. It was just a parked car. No one was hurt. Except Liam, Flynn said coldly. Our son was hurt. By you. The revelation hung between them, the foundation of their marriage crumbling with each passing second. I'll tell the police the truth, Nora said finally. Clear Liam's name. That's not enough, Flynn said. Not nearly enough. Chapter 3. Fault Lines. Flynn sat in his parked truck outside Memorial Hospital, watching the staff entrance. After 3 days of investigation, he'd assembled the pieces of Nora's betrayal. Her affair with Bryce Madigan had begun 4 months ago, following a hospital restructuring that put Madigan in charge of surgical services. Their relationship had quickly intensified, with Nora fabricating late shifts to spend nights at his downtown penthouse. The crash had occurred after one such morning. According to Ruth Benson, Nora had left with Madigan around 8:30 a.m., returning in Flynn's Audi just before noon, visibly distressed and slightly unsteady. She'd then called the police, reporting that Liam had stolen the car. What Nora hadn't known was that Mrs. Keller, whose parked car they'd hit, had installed a dash cam that activated upon impact. Flynn had visited her, pretending to arrange insurance details, and she'd mentioned the footage captured a man in a blue suit exiting the Audi briefly before driving away. Now, as Flynn watched the hospital entrance, he spotted Bryce Madigan leaving the building, tall, polished, with salt and pepper hair and the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Flynn had seen his type before, ambitious climbers who viewed people as stepping stones. Flynn didn't approach him. Not yet. First, he needed to understand the full extent of the relationship and why they'd chosen such a drastic measure as framing Liam. At home, things had deteriorated rapidly. Nora had admitted the affair, but insisted the crash had been an accident, portraying herself as caught between protecting her lover and loyalty to her family. Liam refused to speak to his mother, devastated by her willingness to sacrifice him. Flynn had moved into the guest room, maintaining a cold politeness that unnerved Nora more than anger would have. Those who knew Flynn understood his calm was most dangerous when absolute. On the 4th day after the arrest, Flynn received a call from Detective Michaels. Mr. Mercer, we've received new evidence regarding your son's case. A witness has provided footage showing someone other than your son driving the vehicle during the accident. Flynn feigned surprise. Really? Who was it? We're still investigating, but I wanted you to know the charges against Liam are being dropped. Thank you, Detective. I appreciate your thoroughness. After hanging up, Flynn wondered if Nora had confessed or if the Kellers had submitted their dashcam footage. Either way, Liam was cleared, but that was only the beginning. That evening, Flynn was reviewing documents in his office when the security system chimed, alerting him to motion at the front door. On his monitor, he watched Bryce Madigan ringing the doorbell, looking nervously over his shoulder. Flynn waited until Nora answered before making his way downstairs. He found them in hushed conversation in the foyer, Madigan's hand on Nora's arm. Am I interrupting? Flynn asked calmly. Both jumped. Nora recovered first. Flynn, this is Bryce Madigan, Flynn finished. Hospital administrator. Drunk driver. The man who let my son take the fall for his crime. Madigan straightened his shoulders. Mr. Mercer, I came to apologize. What happened was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility. Full responsibility, Flynn repeated slowly. Interesting phrase from a man who fled the scene and let a teenager get arrested. The police have dropped the charges, Madigan said. I've given a full statement. Flynn stepped closer, noting with satisfaction how Madigan instinctively backed up. And you think that resolves things? My son spent a night in juvenile detention. His record shows an arrest. His mother betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. I understand you're angry. No, Flynn interrupted. You don't understand anything about me. But you will. Nora moved between them. Flynn, please. We made a terrible mistake, but threatening Bryce won't solve anything. I haven't made any threats, Flynn said with unsettling calm. I'm simply promising consequences. Madigan's professional facade cracked slightly. What do you want? Money? I can pay for any damages. Therapy for your son. Flynn laughed, the sound devoid of humor. You think this is transactional? That you can write a check and erase what you've done? He shook his head. No, the consequences I'm talking about can't be resolved so easily. Madigan glanced at Nora, who looked increasingly uneasy. Perhaps we should continue this conversation when emotions aren't so high. Perhaps you should leave my house before I call the police and report a trespasser, Flynn countered. The same police department investigating your DUI and filing false reports. After Madigan left, Nora turned to Flynn, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. What are you planning? Why did you do it? Flynn asked instead. Not the affair, people stray, but framing our son, making him bear the consequences of your actions. Nora's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Bryce was driving, yes, but we only had 2 glasses of wine. When he hit the car, he panicked. His father is on the hospital board. A DUI would have ended his career. So you sacrificed Liam instead. No, I thought they'd see he was just a kid who made a mistake. First offense, no one hurt. I figured he'd get community service at most. I never imagined they'd handcuff him. Flynn studied his wife's face, searching for the woman he'd married. Were you ever going to tell the truth if the security footage hadn't exposed you? Nora couldn't hold his gaze. I don't know, she whispered. I do, Flynn said. And that's why, starting tomorrow, everything changes. Later that night, Flynn sat at his computer, creating a new email account and document folder titled Insurance. Into it, he saved the security footage, the dashcam video from Mrs. Keller, and screenshots of text messages between Nora and Madigan that he'd retrieved from the phone bill records. Flynn had built his career on understanding structural integrity, knowing precisely how much pressure could be applied before something collapsed. Now, he would apply that knowledge to dismantle the lives of those who had betrayed his family. As he worked, a text from Weston arrived. Madigan's background check complete. Call me. It's worse than we thought. Flynn smiled grimly. The fault lines were already appearing. Now was time to trigger the earthquake. Chapter 4. The Evidence. The security system notification pinged on Flynn's phone at 2:37 a.m. He'd been lying awake in the guest room, sleep eluding him as it had for the past week. Tapping the app, he viewed footage from the previous day, standard automatic archiving. As he scrolled through, a clip from the driveway camera caught his attention. There was Nora, clearly intoxicated, stumbling toward his Audi with Bryce Madigan's arm around her waist. Flynn watched as Madigan took his keys from Nora's hand, helped her into the passenger seat, and drove away. Flynn downloaded the video immediately, adding it to his growing collection of evidence. The timestamp read 9:47 a.m., perfectly aligning with the accident timeline. Morning brought a stilted breakfast, with Liam silently eating cereal while Nora attempted normal conversation. Flynn observed the painful dynamic, noting how his son flinched when Nora approached him. I'm meeting with Liam's attorney today, Flynn announced, to ensure the arrest is fully expunged from his record. Nora nodded quickly. Of course. I've already called the station to confirm my statement. Your statement, Flynn repeated. The one where you admit framing our son for a crime he didn't commit? Liam stood abruptly, leaving his half-eaten breakfast. I'll be in the car, Dad. After Liam left, Nora reached for Flynn's hand. He pulled away. Flynn, please. I know what I did was unforgivable, but we can work through this. 15 years of marriage. 15 years I spent believing I knew who you were. Flynn interrupted. Now I realize I never did. At the law office, attorney Danielle Rodriguez reviewed the evidence Flynn had gathered. The charges against Liam have been dropped, she confirmed, but we should petition to have the arrest record sealed immediately. As for Mrs. Mercer and Mr. Madigan, she hesitated. They could face charges for filing a false police report, allowing an unlicensed minor to take blame for a crime, potentially endangerment of a minor and obstruction of justice. What's the likely outcome? Flynn asked. For first-time offenders with good lawyers? Probation, fines, maybe community service. Mr. Madigan might face more serious consequences for the DUI and leaving the scene. Not enough, Flynn said quietly. Danielle studied him. Mr. Mercer, as your attorney, I advise focusing on clearing Liam's record and moving forward. Pursuing maximum punishment against your wife will only prolong the family's suffering. Flynn nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. After leaving Danielle's office, he drove to meet Weston at a quiet cafe away from their usual haunts. Weston slid a folder across the table. Bryce Madigan isn't his real name. He's Blake Morrison, formerly chief administrator at Chicago Memorial until 3 years ago. Flynn opened the folder, finding newspaper clippings and printouts. What happened in Chicago? Sexual harassment allegations from multiple nurses, prescription drug theft, and financial improprieties. Nothing stuck criminally. His father's connections made sure of that, but the hospital quietly asked him to resign. He changed his name slightly, moved to Phoenix, and reinvented himself. Flynn flipped through the documents. His father is Harold Morrison, the pharmaceutical executive? Weston nodded. One of the wealthiest men in Illinois. Used his influence to bury the Chicago scandal and set his son up here with a new identity. But Blake, or Bryce, hasn't changed his ways. I've found 3 complaints from nurses at Memorial already, all hushed up with settlements. Does Nora know who she's involved with? Unknown. But there's more. Weston leaned forward. Remember that accident? The police report shows the damaged vehicle belonged to Teresa Keller. Mrs. Keller with the dash cam, Flynn confirmed. She's not just any victim. She's on the state medical licensing board, the same board currently investigating irregularities in Memorial's anesthesiology department. Flynn's eyes narrowed. Nora's department. Exactly. The hit and run might not have been entirely random. This revelation changed everything. What Flynn had viewed as a regrettable accident resulting from an affair now appeared potentially premeditated, a deliberate attempt to silence an investigator. After Weston left, Flynn remained, staring at his coffee. If Madigan had deliberately targeted Mrs. Keller's car, and Nora had willingly participated in the cover-up by framing their son, the betrayal ran even deeper than he'd imagined. Later that day, Flynn drove to Memorial Hospital's parking garage. Using the employee directory Weston had provided, he located Madigan's reserved space. Empty, as the administrator was in meetings until evening. Flynn carefully placed a small GPS tracker under the rear bumper of the silver Tesla, then made his way to the anesthesiology department. He found Nora reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station. Seeing him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Flynn, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said quietly. Privately, Nora glanced around nervously before leading him to an empty consultation room. "Is Liam okay?" "Tell me about the investigation into your department," Flynn said without preamble. The color drained from Nora's face. "What investigation?" "The state medical board's review of anesthesiology practices at Memorial. The one headed by Teresa Keller, the woman whose car Madigan crashed into." Nora's stunned expression confirmed his suspicions. "How did you? Was it coincidence, Nora? Or did Madigan deliberately target her vehicle?" "It was an accident," Nora insisted, though her voice trembled. "We didn't even know it was her car until afterward. And when you found out, when you realized whose car you'd hit," Nora's silence spoke volumes. "That's why you framed Liam," Flynn continued. "Not just to protect Madigan from a DUI, but to ensure Mrs. Keller wouldn't connect the accident to her investigation." "You don't understand," Nora whispered. "There are discrepancies in the medication logs, missing fentanyl doses. The board thinks someone in our department is diverting drugs. If word got out that the hospital administrator was involved in a hit and run with the lead investigator's car. So you sacrificed our son to protect your career and your lover's reputation," Flynn concluded. "How convenient that your solution solved both problems." "It wasn't like that," Nora pleaded. "Bryce said Liam would get a slap on the wrist at most. We didn't think." "No, you didn't think," Flynn cut her off. "Not about Liam, not about me, not about our family. Only about yourselves." Nora reached for him, but Flynn stepped back. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done from the beginning," Flynn replied. "Protect my son." He left Nora standing in the consultation room, her carefully constructed world beginning to unravel. That night, the GPS tracker showed Madigan's car moving to an address in Scottsdale, an upscale apartment complex. Flynn drove there, parking with a view of the entrance. At 9:43 p.m., Nora's SUV pulled into the visitor's parking. She entered the building, emerging hours later looking disheveled. Despite everything, the visual confirmation of her ongoing affair still felt like a physical blow. Flynn had held out some hope that Nora had ended things with Madigan after the crash, that perhaps there was still something worth salvaging in their family. That hope died as he watched his wife exit the building, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror before driving away. When Flynn returned home, he found Liam waiting up, pretending to watch TV. "You were following Mom, weren't you?" the boy asked without looking away from the screen. Flynn sat beside his son. "How did you know?" "She called, said she was working late. But I saw her leave earlier with a bag." Liam finally turned to him. "She's still seeing him, isn't she? Even after everything." Flynn considered lying to protect his son's feelings, but Liam deserved the truth. "Yes." Liam nodded, his jaw tight. "Are you going to divorce her?" "I think that's inevitable at this point." "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved," Liam admitted. "I can't even look at her anymore. Every time she tries to talk to me, all I can think about is sitting in that holding cell, wondering why my own mother would lie about me." Flynn put an arm around his son's shoulders. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. None of it is your fault." "I know," Liam said. "But Dad, what are you planning? You've got that look." "What look?" "The one you had when those developers tried to tear down the Hawthorne Theater. Like you're about to go to war." Flynn hesitated. "I'm just gathering information." "Bullshit," Liam said. "You're plotting something." "I know you, Dad." Flynn managed a small smile. "I'm ensuring that everyone involved faces appropriate consequences." "Including Mom?" The question hung heavy between them. Flynn chose his words carefully. "Your mother made choices that hurt you deeply. There has to be accountability for that." Liam was silent for a moment. "Just don't do anything that'll make things worse, okay? I just want this to be over." Flynn hugged his son, knowing that while he would honor Liam's wish for resolution, his definition of over included a reckoning that neither Nora nor Madigan anticipated. The next day, Flynn received a call from Detective Michaels. "Mr. Mercer, I thought you should know, we've formally charged Bryce Madigan with DUI, leaving the scene of an accident, and filing a false police report. Your wife has also been charged with filing a false report and endangering a minor. Thank you for letting me know, Detective. When will they appear in court?" "Arraignment is scheduled for Monday. Given their lack of prior records, they'll likely be released on their own recognizance pending trial." After hanging up, Flynn checked his watch. The court hearing mentioned in the original synopsis was approaching, where the CCTV footage would be shown and an eyewitness would testify. It would be Nora and Madigan's first public reckoning, but far from their last. Chapter 5. The Revelation. Flynn sat motionless in the back row of courtroom 3B, watching as Nora and Bryce Madigan entered separately with their attorneys. Neither had spotted him yet, giving Flynn the opportunity to observe their demeanor. Madigan projected confidence in an expensive suit, while Nora looked pale and drawn, her typical poise absent. The courtroom filled with the usual participants in the justice system's daily machinery: lawyers consulting clients, clerks organizing files, bailiffs maintaining order. Flynn recognized Mrs. Keller seated near the front, her silver hair neatly styled, back straight despite her 72 years. Judge Ramona Walsh entered, and the proceedings began with Madigan's arraignment. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, his voice carrying through the courtroom with practiced authority. Nora followed suit, her not guilty barely audible. Flynn had expected this. What he hadn't expected was the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Vincent Rivera, requesting special consideration in the case. "Your Honor, given the nature of these charges involving false accusations against a minor and potential interference with a state medical board investigation, the state requests that all evidence be presented during this hearing, rather than waiting for trial." Judge Walsh frowned. "That's unusual, Mr. Rivera." Defense. Madigan's attorney objected strenuously, but the judge overruled after Rivera mentioned evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. Flynn leaned forward as Rivera called his first witness, Detective Michaels, who testified about the initial police report and subsequent discovery of contradictory evidence. Then came Mrs. Keller, who described finding her parked car damaged and reviewing her dashcam footage. Could you identify the individual you saw exiting the vehicle after the collision? Rivera asked. Mrs. Keller pointed directly at Madigan. That man there. He got out, looked at the damage, then drove away without leaving any information. Rivera nodded. Your Honor, the state would like to present Exhibit C, the dashcam footage from Mrs. Keller's vehicle. The court fell silent as the video played on a monitor. There was Flynn's Audi striking Mrs. Keller's parked car, then Madigan emerging, surveying the damage, and quickly returning to the driver's seat. The camera angle even captured Nora in the passenger seat, her head turning away as if to avoid being identified. Madigan's composed facade cracked slightly as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Nora stared at the floor, shoulders hunched. Next, the state presents Exhibit D, security footage from the Mercer residence. Flynn watched Nora's head snap up in alarm as the courtroom monitor displayed his driveway camera footage. There she was, visibly intoxicated, leaning on Madigan as he took Flynn's car keys and helped her into the passenger seat. The timestamp on this footage is 9:47 a.m., Rivera noted. The accident occurred at approximately 10:23 a.m., consistent with the defendants driving directly from the Mercer residence to the location of the collision. Nora turned, scanning the courtroom until her gaze found Flynn. The shock in her eyes confirmed she hadn't expected this evidence to exist, let alone be presented in court. Rivera wasn't finished. Your Honor, the state calls Teresa Alvarez. A woman in hospital scrubs entered, and Flynn recognized one of Nora's colleagues from the anesthesiology department. Nora's face drained of what little color remained. After being sworn in, Alvarez testified that she had overheard a conversation between Nora and Madigan the day of the accident. They were arguing in the medication storage room, Alvarez explained. Ms. Mercer was saying something about dealing with Keller, and that the investigation had to be stopped. Mr. Madigan said they would take care of it that day. By the time Alvarez finished her testimony, Nora was visibly trembling. Madigan sat rigid, his attorney scribbling furiously beside him. Judge Walsh addressed both defendants sternly. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Bail is set at $150,000 each, with conditions including surrendering of passports and no contact with the victims or witnesses. As bailiffs approached to take Nora and Madigan into custody until bail could be posted, Nora's gaze remained fixed on Flynn. Her expression shifted from shock to understanding as she realized her husband had orchestrated this public revelation of their crimes. Flynn remained seated as the courtroom emptied, processing the day's events. He had expected the security footage to be damaging, but Teresa Alvarez's testimony was an unexpected gift, confirming the premeditated nature of the accident with Mrs. Keller's car. Outside the courthouse, Flynn was approached by Detective Michaels. Quite a revelation in there, she commented. You knew about the security footage all along, didn't you? Flynn nodded. I installed the system after a break-in attempt. Never imagined it would capture something like this. And Alvarez? Did you know she would testify about that conversation? No, Flynn admitted. That was a surprise to me as well. Detective Michaels studied him. Mr. Mercer, in my experience, people who fake shock as well as your wife did today usually have other secrets. If there's anything else I should know about this case, if I discover anything relevant, you'll be the first to know, Flynn assured her. The detective handed him her card. Directly to me, not through channels. Something doesn't add up about the hospital's involvement in all this. Flynn spent the afternoon with Liam, who had decided to stay with Flynn's sister, Bridget, until things settled down. Bridget had always been Flynn's closest ally, standing by him through their turbulent childhood with alcoholic parents and later supporting his career when others dismissed his passion for historical preservation as impractical. You okay, little brother? Bridget asked as they watched Liam shoot baskets in her driveway. You've got that 1,000-yard stare. Flynn exhaled slowly. I keep thinking I should feel something more. Anger, grief, something. Instead, I just feel. Resolved, Bridget finished. I recognize it from when you were 8 and decided you would get us out of Dad's house someday. That same quiet determination. They targeted Mrs. Keller deliberately, Bridge. It wasn't just an accident they covered up. They planned to hit her car to intimidate her about some investigation. Bridget's expression hardened, and they framed my nephew. What's your next move? Nora called twice from the detention center. I haven't answered. Will you? Flynn considered the question. Not yet. Let her sit with the consequences for a while. After dinner with Bridget and Liam, Flynn drove to his empty house. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A man emerged, late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite the Phoenix heat. Mr. Mercer? The man called. Harold Morrison. I believe we need to talk. Flynn recognized the name immediately. Bryce Madigan's father, the pharmaceutical executive who had helped his son escape consequences in Chicago. Not interested, Flynn said, continuing toward his front door. Morrison followed, his voice carrying a practiced charm that had likely opened many doors. I understand your anger. What my son and your wife did was inexcusable, but perhaps we can discuss a resolution that benefits everyone. Flynn turned, studying the older man. By resolution, you mean by my silence? Helping your son escape consequences again. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. I prefer to think of it as compensation for your family's distress. Your son's education fully funded, perhaps. A generous divorce settlement for you. My son was handcuffed and jailed for a crime your son committed, Flynn said evenly. Then they tried to obstruct a medical board investigation by targeting an investigator. There's no price tag for that. Everything has a price, Mr. Mercer, Morrison countered. Even principles. Flynn stepped closer. Not mine. Something in Flynn's tone made Morrison reassess him. I admire your conviction, but consider the practical aspects. A drawn-out trial will only traumatize your son further. Is that a threat? Flynn asked quietly. A reality check. My son's attorney will question your son's character, your parenting, your marriage, anything to create reasonable doubt. Is that really what you want for Liam? Flynn felt cold fury building. Let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Morrison. Your son and my wife conspired to commit a crime, then framed my teenage son to cover it up. If you think I'll back down because of courtroom tactics, you've misjudged me severely. Morrison's facade of reasonableness slipped slightly. Don't be foolish. My son will receive the best defense money can buy. Your wife will claim coercion. The evidence will be contested. In the end, they'll likely serve minimal consequences while your family is dragged through the mud. Perhaps, Flynn acknowledged. Or perhaps there's more evidence than was presented today. Something in Flynn's tone made Morrison pause. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that your visit here has accomplished the opposite of your intention. I'm now more determined than ever to see this through. After Morrison left, Flynn called Weston. I need everything you can find on Harold Morrison's pharmaceutical connections to Memorial Hospital. Already working on it, Weston replied. Preliminary research shows Morrison's company supplies most of the hospital's anesthesia medications, including fentanyl. The same drug Nora mentioned was missing from inventory logs, Flynn noted. Exactly. And guess who sits on the committee that approves pharmaceutical contracts? Our friend Bryce Madigan. The pieces were falling into place. The missing drugs, Madigan's position, Morrison's pharmaceutical company, the medical board investigation, and Nora's involvement through the anesthesiology department. Flynn considered his next move carefully. Harold Morrison's visit confirmed that Madigan's family would use every resource to protect him. Flynn needed to ensure the evidence was so overwhelming that even Morrison's influence couldn't overcome it. Later that night, Flynn finally answered Nora's call from the detention center. Flynn, thank God. Her voice sounded desperate. You have to help me. This is all a misunderstanding. Stop, Flynn interrupted. No more lies, Nora. I saw the footage. I heard the testimony. A pause. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Bryce convinced me Mrs. Keller was on a witch hunt, that she was going to shut down our department over paperwork errors. Was he stealing drugs, Nora? Is that what the investigation was really about? Another pause, longer this time. I didn't know at first, she admitted finally. I noticed discrepancies in the logs months ago, but Bryce explained it away as computer errors. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already involved. Involved how? He asked me to sign off on inventory reports. Said it was just to get the board off our backs until the system could be updated. Flynn closed his eyes, picturing his wife of 15 years falsifying medical records. And when did you realize he was actually diverting drugs? The morning of the accident, Nora's voice cracked. He was acting strange, jittery. When I confronted him, he admitted he'd been taking fentanyl, said it helped with the pressure of the job. That morning, Mrs. Keller had requested specific inventory records going back 6 months. He panicked. So you got drunk with him, let him drive my car, and then helped frame our son when he crashed, Flynn summarized coldly. I was afraid, Nora whispered. Bryce said if the diversion was discovered, I'd lose my license, maybe face charges. He convinced me it was just a minor accident, that Liam would get a slap on the wrist while we figured out how to handle the investigation. And that justified throwing our son to the wolves? Silence. I want a divorce, Nora, Flynn said finally. I've already contacted an attorney. Please, Flynn, Nora begged. I made a terrible mistake, but 16 years of marriage ended the moment you chose Madigan over our son, Flynn finished. There's nothing left to discuss. After hanging up, Flynn sat in the darkness of his home office, processing Nora's partial confession. She had admitted to knowingly falsifying medical records, but portrayed herself as manipulated by Madigan rather than an active participant in the drug diversion. Flynn didn't believe her. The Nora he had known, or thought he knew, was too intelligent, too detail-oriented to miss systematic theft from her department. Her claim of ignorance until the morning of the accident contradicted Teresa Alvarez's testimony about their premeditated plan to deal with Keller. As he contemplated the disparity, Flynn received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line read simply, "About Bryce Madigan." Inside was a single document, a scanned letter from Chicago Memorial's legal department to Madigan, then Morrison, detailing allegations of sexual harassment and drug theft. The final paragraph mentioned a nurse named Rebecca Winters, who had filed a formal complaint about Morrison pressuring her to falsify narcotic inventory records. The email signature contained only a line. From one survivor to another, you're not alone. Flynn immediately searched for Rebecca Winters online, finding her listed as a nurse anesthetist at a hospital in Tucson. He saved her contact information, knowing she might be key to understanding the full pattern of Madigan's behavior and potentially providing crucial testimony. The pieces of Flynn's counterattack were coming together. But first, he needed to understand exactly what they had been planning against Mrs. Keller and how deep the conspiracy extended into Memorial's administration. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. 3 weeks after the courtroom revelation, Flynn stood beside Liam in the empty living room of their former home. Movers had already transported their belongings to the modern condo Flynn had purchased downtown, closer to his office and Liam's school. The house, once their sanctuary, now echoed with painful memories. "Ready?" Flynn asked his son. Liam nodded, taking a final glance around. "Yeah, nothing left here for us." As they locked the door for the final time, Flynn's phone rang. Detective Michaels. "Mr. Mercer, we found something you should see. Can you come to the station?" At police headquarters, Michaels led Flynn to an interview room where a laptop waited. "We executed a search warrant on Mr. Madigan's cloud storage as part of the ongoing investigation," she explained. "Among his files, we found these recorded conversations." Flynn listened as Madigan's voice emerged from the speakers. "Keller's getting too close. The audit next week will expose everything." Then Nora's voice. "We could delay the audit. Say we need more time to reconcile the inventory." "We've used that excuse twice," Madigan replied. "No, we need to neutralize Keller directly." Michaels stopped the recording. "There are dozens of these over the past 3 months. Your wife was fully aware of the drug diversion scheme from the beginning. In fact, she appears to have been instrumental in concealing it." The revelation, while not surprising, still felt like a physical blow. Flynn had suspected Nora was more deeply involved than she'd admitted, but hearing her voice calmly discussing criminal activities shattered any lingering doubts. "There's more," Michaels continued hesitantly. "The plan to target Mrs. Keller wasn't just intimidation. Listen." She played another recording, this one from the day before the accident. "Madigan, I've done some research. Keller takes the same route to work every day, parks in the same spot. Nora, what are you suggesting?" "Madigan, an accident. Nothing serious, just enough to shake her up, maybe hospitalize her briefly while we clean up the evidence." "Nora, that's insane. We can't just—" "Madigan, you're already implicated, Nora. Those inventory reports have your signature. If I go down, you go down." A pause, then Nora's voice, quieter. "How would we even do it without getting caught?" "They were planning to deliberately injure Mrs. Keller," Flynn said, the full implications sinking in. "Not just hit her car, but hit her." Michaels nodded grimly. "The accident with her parked car appears to have been unplanned. They were intoxicated and hit it before they could execute their actual scheme. But the intent was there." "Attempted murder," Flynn murmured. "Conspiracy at minimum," Michaels confirmed. "The DA is amending the charges as we speak. Both will likely face significant prison time." After leaving the police station, Flynn sat in his truck, processing this latest revelation. The woman he'd married, the mother of his child, had not only participated in drug theft and framing their son, but had conspired to physically harm an elderly woman to cover their crimes. His phone buzzed with a text from Weston. "Meeting with Rebecca Winters confirmed for tomorrow. 2 p.m. my office." Flynn had reached out to the nurse from Chicago, who had agreed to fly to Phoenix to share her experiences with Madigan/Morrison. If her testimony corroborated the pattern of behavior, drug theft, falsified records, intimidation, it would further strengthen the case against both Madigan and Nora. That evening, Flynn met with his divorce attorney, Samuel Peters, who reviewed the new evidence. "This changes everything," Peters noted. "With criminal charges this serious, Ms. Mercer will have minimal leverage in divorce proceedings. We can push for the most favorable terms." Flynn nodded, though financial considerations seemed almost trivial compared to the moral betrayal. "I want full custody of Liam. No visitation until he's ready, if he's ever ready." "Given the circumstances, that's virtually guaranteed," Peters assured him. "A mother who frames her child for a crime, then conspires to harm someone to cover up her own criminal activities. No judge would grant her access against the child's wishes." The next day, Flynn and Weston met Rebecca Winters, a composed woman in her 30s whose calm demeanor couldn't fully mask the tension in her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," Flynn said. "I know this can't be easy. When I heard Blake Morrison was using a new name and doing the same things in Phoenix, I couldn't stay silent," she replied. "Not again." Over the next hour, Rebecca detailed her experience in Chicago, how Madigan, then Morrison, had systematically diverted narcotics, falsified records, and pressured staff to cooperate through a combination of threats and charm. "He targeted vulnerable people," she explained. "Nurses with financial problems, personal issues, or professional insecurities. Made them feel special at first, then gradually involved them in his schemes until they were too compromised to report him." "That sounds like what happened with my wife," Flynn acknowledged. Rebecca nodded sympathetically. "It's his pattern. By the time I realized what was happening and reported him, he'd already compromised 3 other nurses in my department. His father's connections ensured he faced no criminal charges, just a quiet resignation and a move to another state." "Would you be willing to testify about this pattern of behavior?" Weston asked. "That's why I'm here," Rebecca confirmed. "I couldn't live with myself if he hurt more people because I stayed silent." Flynn arranged for Rebecca to meet with Detective Michaels, providing another crucial piece in building the case against Madigan and, by extension, Nora. The following week brought another development, a call from Harold Morrison requesting another meeting. This time, Flynn agreed, choosing a public cafe for the encounter. Morrison looked significantly less composed than during their previous meeting. The strain of his son's expanded charges showed in the tightness around his eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he began without preamble, The situation has escalated beyond what anyone intended. Beyond what anyone intended? Flynn repeated incredulously. Your son and my wife conspired to physically harm a state medical board investigator. They framed my 16-year-old son for a crime. They stole narcotics from a hospital. Which part was unintentional? Morrison's jaw tightened. I'm not here to defend their actions. I'm here to propose a resolution that prevents further damage to all parties involved. I'm listening, Flynn said, though his tone suggested little receptivity. My son will plead guilty to reduced charges, drug possession, reckless endangerment, and filing a false report. In exchange, the conspiracy charges would be dropped. Your wife would receive a similar deal. And why would I support such an arrangement? Morrison leaned forward. Because the alternative is a highly publicized trial that will drag your son's name through the press for months. Because even with a plea, my son and your wife will serve time, just not the decade or more they're currently facing. Flynn studied the man across from him, a powerful figure accustomed to manipulating outcomes to his advantage. Why come to me? This is between your son's attorneys and the prosecutor. The DA's office has indicated they would consider the deal if the victims didn't object, Morrison admitted. Mrs. Keller has tentatively agreed, primarily due to her health concerns about a lengthy trial, which leaves you and your son. Flynn considered his options carefully. A plea deal would mean certainty. Madigan and Nora would definitely serve some time, face professional consequences, and have criminal records. A trial meant the possibility of harsher sentences, but also the risk of acquittal if Morrison hired skilled enough attorneys. I'll need to discuss this with my son, Flynn said finally. He's the one they victimized most directly. Morrison nodded, appearing relieved at even this minimal concession. Of course, I understand family considerations. As Morrison rose to leave, Flynn added, one more thing. My agreement to consider this proposal is contingent on full financial disclosure of your pharmaceutical company's relationship with Memorial Hospital, specifically documentation of all narcotic shipments to the anesthesiology department over the past 3 years. Morrison's expression hardened. That's not relevant to the criminal case. It is if your company was knowingly supplying more narcotics than the hospital legitimately required, Flynn countered. If inventory discrepancies were ignored because of your son's position. You're overstepping, Morrison warned. No, Flynn replied calmly. I'm ensuring that everyone involved faces appropriate consequences, including those who enabled the situation through willful blindness. After Morrison departed, visibly unsettled, Flynn called Weston to update him on the conversation. He's worried about more than his son, Weston assessed. If Morrison Pharmaceuticals gets implicated in a drug diversion scheme, the company could face federal charges, lose government contracts. Exactly, Flynn agreed, which gives us leverage to ensure neither Madigan nor Nora gets off lightly. That evening, Flynn discussed the potential plea deal with Liam, who had been living with Bridget since the arrest but visited Flynn's condo regularly. Will they go to jail? Liam asked after Flynn explained the situation. Yes, but for less time than if they're convicted at trial. Maybe 2 to 3 years instead of 10 to 15. Liam considered this. And we wouldn't have to testify or have our family all over the news. That's the main advantage, Flynn confirmed. We could put this behind us sooner. Liam was quiet for a long time. I don't want Mom to spend a decade in prison, he finally said. But I don't want her to get away with it, either. She won't get away with it, Flynn assured him. Even with a plea deal, her nursing license will be revoked. She'll have a felony record. Her life, as she knew it, is over regardless. Then I think we should agree, Liam decided. Not for her sake, but for ours. I'm tired of being that kid whose mom framed him. I want to move on. Flynn embraced his son, struck by his maturity amid such betrayal. Then that's what we'll do. The next day, Flynn informed Detective Michaels of their decision, with conditions. Both Madigan and Nora would serve actual prison time, not probation. They would provide complete testimony about the drug diversion scheme, and Morrison Pharmaceuticals would submit to an independent audit of their hospital supply records. Over the following weeks, the legal machinery ground forward. Nora made multiple attempts to contact Flynn directly, but he maintained boundaries, communicating only through attorneys. The divorce proceedings progressed concurrently with the criminal case, with Nora's deteriorating position giving Flynn favorable terms on all fronts. 6 weeks after the courtroom revelation, both Madigan and Nora appeared before Judge Walsh to enter guilty pleas. Flynn and Liam attended, sitting beside Mrs. Keller in the front row. Flynn observed his soon-to-be ex-wife closely. The prison issued clothing hanging loosely on her frame, her copper hair dulled, dark circles beneath her eyes as she responded to the judge's questions in a subdued voice. For a moment, watching the woman he had loved for 16 years facing the consequences of her actions, Flynn felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Anger still, but also sadness for what they had lost, for the family that had been shattered. Then he remembered the recordings, her willing participation in framing their son, her callous planning to harm an innocent woman, and his resolve hardened once more. After the hearing, as Nora was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Flynn and Liam, a pleading gaze that neither returned. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Harold Morrison, whose pharmaceutical company stock had plummeted 30% since the investigation expanded to include their supply practices. Flynn navigated Liam through the crowd toward their vehicle, where Bridget waited. "Is it over?" Liam asked as they drove away. Flynn glanced at his son, seeing both the child he had raised and the man emerging from adversity. "The criminal case is mostly resolved. The divorce will be finalized soon, but recovery takes longer." Liam nodded, looking out the window at the Phoenix skyline. "At least now we can start." Flynn squeezed his son's shoulder, knowing that while the legal battles were concluding, the emotional aftermath would continue. But they would face it together, rebuilding their lives with truth as the foundation. That night, Flynn sat on his condo balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the desert sky. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Michaels. "Federal investigation into Morrison Pharmaceuticals officially open today. Your evidence made the difference." Flynn allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Justice was unfolding on multiple fronts, holding accountable not just Nora and Madigan, but the systems that had enabled them. The security camera notification that had appeared on his phone that fateful night, showing his wife's betrayal in undeniable clarity, had initiated a cascade of revelations and consequences. The truth, once exposed, had proven unstoppable. Flynn raised his glass to the night sky. Some structures, he knew from his professional experience, could not be saved once their foundation was compromised. The only solution was demolition and rebuilding on stronger ground. Chapter 7. The Countermove. 6 months after Nora and Bryce Madigan began serving their sentences, Flynn's life had established a new rhythm. The divorce had been finalized with terms heavily favoring Flynn. Full custody of Liam, the condo, and most of their assets, while Nora's legal troubles had left her financially devastated. Flynn's architectural restoration business was thriving, with the Hawthorne Theater project becoming a showcase of his firm's abilities. Liam had returned to a semblance of normalcy, excelling in school and finding solace in his drama club activities. On a crisp October morning, Flynn reviewed blueprints in his downtown office when Weston burst in without knocking. "Have you seen this?" he demanded, slapping a folder on Flynn's desk. Inside was a lawsuit naming Flynn as defendant, filed by Nora from prison, accusing him of orchestrating a complex setup to frame her and Madigan by tampering with security camera footage and colluding with Mrs. Keller. "This is absurd," Flynn muttered, scanning the document. The evidence against them was overwhelming. "It gets worse," Weston said grimly. "Morrison Pharmaceuticals filed a separate action claiming you fabricated evidence to trigger the federal investigation into their company. They're seeking $40 million in damages for stock devaluation." Flynn leaned back, processing this counterattack. Harold Morrison's handiwork. "He's trying to discredit the evidence against his company by undermining my credibility." "It's a desperate move," Weston agreed, "but potentially devastating. Legal fees alone could bankrupt you, even if you eventually win." Flynn's phone rang. Danielle Rodriguez, his attorney. "I've just been served with 2 lawsuits," he answered without preamble. "I know," Danielle replied. "I'm already drafting our responses." These claims are frivolous, but we need to take them seriously. Can you come to my office this afternoon? After hanging up, Flynn explained the situation to Weston. Morrison is using his resources for a final counterattack. Nora likely agreed to file her lawsuit as a condition of his funding her legal team. What's your plan? Weston asked, recognizing the calculated look in Flynn's eyes. First, strengthen our defensive position. Then identify the weakest point in their alliance, Flynn replied. Every structure has a breaking point, even one built by a pharmaceutical magnate. At Danielle's office that afternoon, she outlined their legal strategy. These lawsuits are primarily intimidation tactics. They know they can't win on the merits, but they can drain your resources and damage your reputation during discovery. How do we counter that? Flynn asked. We file immediate motions to dismiss based on the established evidence in the criminal cases. We also request sanctions against their attorneys for filing frivolous claims. She hesitated. However, litigation is expensive, Flynn. Morrison has deeper pockets than you. I won't be bullied into submission, Flynn stated firmly. Not after what they did to Liam. Danielle nodded. There's another angle we could pursue. Morrison's legal attack opens the door for us to investigate their finances through discovery. If they're claiming damage to their business, we have the right to examine their books. Flynn considered this, which might reveal additional evidence of pharmaceutical improprieties. Exactly. They're counting on you settling quickly to avoid financial strain. But if we counterattack through discovery, they may reconsider. After leaving Danielle's office, Flynn drove to visit Rebecca Winters, who had relocated to Phoenix to assist with the ongoing federal investigation into Morrison Pharmaceuticals. They're desperate, Rebecca observed after Flynn explained the lawsuits. The federal investigation is uncovering systematic problems in their supply chain management. Several hospitals have reported similar patterns of narcotic diversion involving their products. How high up does it go? Flynn asked, potentially to Harold Morrison himself. Internal emails suggest he was aware of inventory discrepancies, but instructed staff to maintain good relationships with hospital administrators like his son. Flynn absorbed this information. Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement about what you've learned? It could help counter these lawsuits. Rebecca hesitated. The federal investigation is still ongoing. I can't share confidential information. I understand, Flynn assured her. But your experiences in Chicago, those are your personal testimony. She nodded slowly. I'll speak with the federal prosecutor. If she approves, I'll help however I can. Later that evening, Flynn received an unexpected call from Mrs. Keller. Mr. Mercer, I've been served with a subpoena for all my communications with you regarding the accident, she informed him. They're claiming we conspired to set up Mrs. Mercer and Mr. Madigan. They're desperate, Flynn reassured her. The evidence speaks for itself. There's something else, Mrs. Keller continued. Before all this happened, I was investigating missing fentanyl at 3 different hospitals, all supplied by Morrison Pharmaceuticals. The pattern suggests a systematic issue, not just individual theft. Did you share this with the federal investigators? Flynn asked. Yes, but some of my records were on a personal laptop that was stolen from my home last week, Mrs. Keller replied, concern evident in her voice. The break-in looked random, but now I'm not so sure. The theft of Mrs. Keller's laptop raised alarms. Flynn immediately called Detective Michaels to report this development. I'll increase patrols near Mrs. Keller's residence, Michaels promised. This could indicate Morrison is getting desperate. Be careful, Flynn. Money and desperation make a dangerous combination. Flynn took the warning seriously, implementing additional security measures at his condo and Liam's school. He also arranged for Bridget to stay with him temporarily, ensuring Liam was never alone. The following week brought the first court hearing on lawsuits. Nora appeared in prison attire, flanked by attorneys Flynn recognized as from one of Phoenix's most expensive firms, clearly funded by Morrison. Harold Morrison himself sat directly behind them, his expression inscrutable. Danielle presented their motion to dismiss, highlighting the overwhelming evidence from the criminal cases and the suspicious timing of these new allegations. Your Honor, she concluded, These lawsuits represent a transparent attempt to retaliate against Mr. Mercer for exposing criminal activity. They lack any factual basis and should be dismissed with prejudice. The opposing counsel argued that new evidence suggested tampering with the security footage and collusion between Flynn and Mrs. Keller. When pressed by the judge, however, they were vague about the nature of this evidence. Judge Richard Hernandez, a no-nonsense jurist with 20 years on the bench, seemed skeptical of the claims against Flynn but denied the motion to dismiss. These allegations, while questionable, require factual determination, he ruled. However, I'm placing strict limits on discovery and will be closely monitoring for abusive tactics. Outside the courtroom, Flynn confronted Harold Morrison directly. "This won't work," he stated quietly. "You're only digging a deeper hole." Morrison's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you've overplayed your hand, Mr. Mercer. Not everyone who opposes me ends up victorious." "I'm not opposing you," Flynn replied. "I'm simply ensuring accountability for actions that harm my family. You chose to make this a larger battle." As Morrison walked away, Flynn noticed someone watching their exchange, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who seemed vaguely familiar. The man nodded slightly in Flynn's direction before following Morrison. That evening, Flynn received an anonymous email with a subject line that made his pulse quicken: "Morrison Family Secrets." The message contained only a phone number and a cryptic note: "Not all allies wear the same uniform. Call if you want to turn the tide." Flynn debated whether this was a trap, perhaps Morrison attempting to entice him into something that could damage his case. After careful consideration, he called the number from a prepaid phone purchased for the occasion. "I wondered if you'd call," a male voice answered. "We met briefly today. I was observing your conversation with Harold." "Who are you?" Flynn asked directly. "Someone with a vested interest in seeing Morrison's empire crumbled. You can call me Phillips. I represent certain stockholders who believe the company's direction under Harold has become problematic." "Why contact me?" "Because you've become the focal point of Harold's obsession. He's committing significant resources to destroying you rather than addressing the federal investigation properly. Some of us view this as fiduciary negligence." Flynn considered his response carefully. "What exactly are you offering?" "Information that connects Harold directly to the drug diversion scheme. Not just negligence or looking the other way, but active participation. Evidence that he directed hospital administrators to establish inventory adjustment protocols that facilitated theft. Why not take this to the federal investigators?" "Corporate politics," Phillips replied. "Some of us need plausible deniability. But you, as a private citizen being attacked by Morrison, could use this information defensively without the same complications." Flynn remained skeptical. "I'd need verification. Check your email in 1 hour. You'll find documents that should satisfy your concerns. If you choose to use them, that's your decision. All I ask is that my involvement remains confidential." After ending the call, Flynn contacted Detective Michaels to discuss this development. "Proceed with extreme caution," she advised. "This could be legitimate. Corporate whistleblowers often emerge when ships start sinking, but it could also be a trap to discredit you further." "I'll have the documents authenticated before taking any action," Flynn promised. An hour later, the promised email arrived containing scanned documents, board meeting minutes, emails, and financial records showing Harold Morrison had implemented a system of inventory reconciliation adjustments at multiple hospitals where his son and other allies held administrative positions. Most damning was an email from Harold to Bryce. "The Keller situation needs resolution before the audit. Use whatever means necessary to delay her investigation. Financial incentives preferred, but other options available if required." Flynn forwarded the documents to Danielle and Detective Michaels for verification, careful to protect the source. If authentic, these records provided a direct link between Harold Morrison and the conspiracy against Mrs. Keller, transforming what had appeared to be Bryce and Nora's scheme into part of a larger corporate criminal enterprise. 3 days later, Detective Michaels confirmed the documents appeared genuine based on comparison with records already obtained through the federal investigation. "This changes everything," she noted. These records suggest Harold Morrison wasn't just protecting his son after the fact. He was directing actions against Mrs. Keller from the beginning. With this new evidence, Danielle filed a countersuit against Morrison Pharmaceuticals and Harold personally, alleging malicious prosecution, defamation, and conspiracy. "This puts us on the offensive," Danielle explained to Flynn. "Now we control part of the discovery process, and we can depose Harold directly about these documents." The strategic shift produced immediate results. 2 days after filing the countersuit, Danielle received a call from Morrison's attorneys requesting a confidential meeting to discuss potential resolution of all pending matters. Flynn agreed to the meeting, but insisted it occur at Danielle's office rather than on Morrison's territory. When Harold Morrison arrived, accompanied by his legal team, the pharmaceutical executive appeared significantly less composed than during their previous encounters. Let's be frank, Morrison began after preliminaries. "This legal battle benefits none of us. I propose a mutual withdrawal of all claims, with each party bearing their own costs." Danielle smiled thinly. "That might have been acceptable before we obtained evidence of your direct involvement in the conspiracy against Mrs. Keller. Now our terms have changed." She outlined their counterproposal. Morrison would withdraw all lawsuits, issue a public apology to Flynn and Liam, establish a victims' compensation fund for hospitals affected by the drug diversion scheme, and step down as CEO of Morrison Pharmaceuticals. Morrison's face flushed with anger. "Absolutely not. You're overreaching based on documents of questionable provenance." "Documents were prepared to submit to the court," Danielle countered calmly. "And to the media, if necessary." "This is blackmail," Morrison sputtered. "This is accountability," Flynn corrected. "You directed your son to obstruct a legal investigation by any means necessary. Those means included framing my teenage son and planning to harm Mrs. Keller." Morrison's attorneys requested a private conference with their client. When they returned 30 minutes later, Morrison's demeanor had changed markedly. "I'll withdraw the lawsuits and issue a private apology," he offered. "The compensation fund is negotiable, but stepping down is off the table." Flynn and Danielle exchanged glances. "We can work with that framework," Danielle allowed, "but we'll need additional safeguards to ensure you don't simply restart this battle once the current pressure subsides." They spent the next 3 hours negotiating terms. By the end, Morrison had agreed to withdraw all litigation, establish a $10 million victims fund, provide a written apology to Flynn and Liam, and recuse himself from any business decisions involving the hospitals where drug diversion had occurred. As Morrison prepared to leave, Flynn asked for a moment alone with him. When the others had exited, Flynn posed the question that had been bothering him. "Why go to such lengths to destroy me? The federal investigation was happening regardless of my involvement." Morrison studied Flynn with grudging respect. When you've spent decades building something, you develop instinct about threats. Most people fold under pressure, take settlements, sign NDAs, disappear. You didn't. That made you dangerous. "I was never targeting your company," Flynn pointed out. "I was protecting my son." "Perhaps," Morrison acknowledged, "but you became a catalyst for forces that were already gathering against me." In business, eliminating catalysts is often simpler than addressing systemic problems. As Morrison departed, Flynn recognized something familiar in the man's calculated approach. The same ruthless pragmatism Flynn himself had employed in dismantling Nora and Madigan's deception. The recognition was unsettling. Later that night, Flynn received another call from mysterious Phillips. "I see Morrison is withdrawing his lawsuits," Phillips noted. "Congratulations." "The documents were helpful," Flynn acknowledged, "though I'm still curious about your motivation." Let's just say Harold's fixation on personal vendettas rather than proper corporate governance has concerned the board for some time. This situation provided an opportunity to redirect the company's future. "You're planning a takeover," Flynn realized. Phillips chuckled. "The board votes on leadership next month. Harold's position has been significantly weakened by the federal investigation and his mishandling of the litigation against you. Change is inevitable." After hanging up, Flynn pondered the layers of manipulation at play. He had become a pawn in corporate power struggles that extended far beyond his original goal of protecting his family. Yet he had also masterfully used these larger forces to ensure justice for Liam. The next day, the lawsuits against Flynn were formally withdrawn. Local media reported a confidential settlement had been reached, while business publications noted Morrison Pharmaceuticals had established a substantial fund for addressing inventory discrepancies at partner hospitals. Flynn's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Michaels, federal indictments coming next week. Morrison and 3 other executives named. Justice was unfolding on multiple fronts, though Flynn found his victory tempered by awareness of the complex web of interests that had facilitated it. Still, the primary objective had been achieved: Liam's vindication and the accountability of those responsible for framing him. That evening, Flynn and Liam sat on their condo balcony, the lights of Phoenix spreading below them like a constellation. "Is it really over now?" Liam asked. Flynn nodded. "Morrison has withdrawn everything. The lawsuits are gone." Liam seemed to process this. "Mom wrote me a letter from prison. Asked if I'd visit her." Flynn carefully controlled his expression. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," Liam admitted. "Part of me never wants to see her again. Another part has questions only she can answer." "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," Flynn assured him. "There's no right or wrong response to what happened." Liam leaned against his father's shoulder, a gesture he had mostly outgrown in recent years, but occasionally returned to in moments of vulnerability. "You know what's weird?" he said after a while. "Through all of this, Mom's betrayal, the arrest, everything, I never doubted you'd fix it. Not once." Flynn felt a tightness in his chest, pride mingled with the weight of his son's faith. "We fixed it together," he corrected gently. "Your strength through all this amazed me." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Flynn reflected on the journey from that first security camera notification to this moment of tentative peace. The foundation of their family had been irreparably damaged, but from the ruins, they had constructed something perhaps stronger, a relationship built on proven loyalty rather than assumed bonds. The reconstruction was still underway, but the structural integrity looked promising. Chapter 8. The Revelation. 1 year after Nora began serving her sentence, Flynn stood before the restored facade of the Hawthorne Theater, cameras flashing as he cut the ceremonial ribbon. The project had become a symbol of rebirth for downtown Phoenix and a professional triumph for Flynn's firm. "This building represents the principle that guides all our work," Flynn told the assembled crowd. "With proper care and commitment, what seems broken can be restored to glory." As the audience applauded, Flynn spotted a familiar face near the back, Detective Michaels, who had become something of an ally through the aftermath of Nora's case. She nodded slightly, indicating she needed to speak with him. After the ceremony concluded, Flynn made his way to her. "Detective Michaels, I didn't expect to see you here." "Congratulations on the theater," she said, gesturing to the gleaming Art Deco facade. "But I'm here officially. There's been a development in the Morrison Pharmaceuticals case that affects you directly." They walked to a quieter spot away from the dispersing crowd. "Harold Morrison has agreed to a plea deal," Michaels explained. "In exchange for reduced charges, he's providing evidence against larger pharmaceutical distributors involved in nationwide diversion schemes." "How does this affect me?" Flynn asked. As part of his cooperation, Morrison has revealed something unexpected. Michaels hesitated. "It concerns your wife, ex-wife," she corrected herself. "Nora? What about her?" According to Morrison, her involvement in the drug diversion wasn't just through Bryce Madigan. She was already involved before they met, specifically recruited because of her position in anesthesiology. Flynn frowned, processing this information. Recruited by whom? By Morrison himself. Apparently, Memorial wasn't the only hospital where they had established this scheme. They targeted facilities across multiple states, placing cooperative administrators and medical personnel in key positions. The revelation shifted Flynn's understanding of the entire situation. So Nora's relationship with Madigan may have been orchestrated from the beginning, Michaels confirmed. Morrison claims he suggested his son pursue her after identifying her as someone who could be compromised. Flynn felt a strange disconnection, as though discussing strangers rather than his family. What led to her being targeted? Michaels consulted her notes. Financial troubles, primarily. She had significant debt from her brother's failed business venture, a loan she co-signed. Morrison's organization offered to resolve the debt in exchange for inventory management cooperation. Flynn had known about Nora's brother's business failure 6 years ago, but she had always maintained the financial impact was minimal. Another lie in a marriage apparently built on deception. Why tell me this now? Flynn asked. 2 reasons, Michaels replied. First, this information will become public when Morrison's plea deal is finalized next week. I wanted you to hear it directly rather than through media reports. Second, the prosecutor believes Nora may have information relevant to cases in other jurisdictions. They're considering offering her a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. Flynn absorbed this, uncertainty creeping through his carefully reconstructed life. I appreciate the warning, Detective. There's one more thing, Michaels added. Morrison claims Nora became problematic when she developed genuine feelings for Madigan. Apparently, their relationship wasn't supposed to become as involved as it did, which complicated the original arrangement. Flynn almost laughed at the irony. Nora's genuine affair with Madigan had disrupted her professional criminal relationship with him. The layers of betrayal seemed boundless. Thank you for telling me personally, Flynn said finally. I'll need to prepare Liam for this news. After Michaels departed, Flynn remained beside the beautifully restored theater, struck by how thoroughly he had misunderstood his own marriage. He had been constructing a narrative where Nora, his partner of 16 years, had been corrupted by Madigan's influence, led astray from an otherwise honest life. Now it appeared she had been complicit in criminal activity for years before meeting Madigan. Had any of it been real? Their courtship during his hospital stay, the early years raising Liam, the shared dreams and struggles, all now cast in shadow by this revelation. Flynn drove to his condo in a daze, grateful that Liam was at drama rehearsal and wouldn't witness his distress. He poured himself a whiskey and sat on the balcony, watching the sunset paint Phoenix in amber and gold. His phone rang. Bridget, always intuitive about her brother's moods. What's wrong? You sound off. Flynn explained Detective Michaels' revelation about Nora's longer involvement in the drug scheme. Damn, Bridget breathed. Just when you think you've processed everything, another bomb drops. I keep thinking about all the times she worked late, all the hospital functions that seemed so important, Flynn said. Was she stealing drugs the whole time? Was our entire marriage a cover for her criminal activities? Don't do this to yourself, Bridget cautioned. You'll never know exactly when things changed or how much was genuine. What matters is how you move forward. Liam has been considering visiting her, Flynn noted. This will complicate that decision. Or simplify it, Bridget suggested. Sometimes understanding the full truth, however painful, provides clearer direction. After hanging up, Flynn received a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. About Nora. Important. Rebecca Winters. Flynn called immediately. Rebecca? How did you get my number? Detective Michaels, she explained. I've been working with the federal task force on the Morrison case. I just learned about Harold Morrison's claims regarding your ex-wife. You have information about Nora? Flynn prompted. Not exactly. Rebecca hesitated. But I recognize some inconsistencies in Morrison's statements about her recruitment. I think he might be manipulating the narrative to secure better terms for himself. They arranged to meet at a cafe near Flynn's office the following morning. When Rebecca arrived, she carried a thick folder and appeared nervous. I shouldn't be doing this, she admitted. But after everything your family has endured because of Morrison, you deserve the complete truth. She opened the folder, revealing documents from the federal investigation. Morrison claims Nora was recruited 6 years ago due to financial problems from her brother's business failure. But these bank records show her brother's loan was settled through a legitimate insurance payout after his business property was damaged in a fire. Flynn frowned. So there was no financial leverage? None that we can find, Rebecca confirmed. Furthermore, the timeline doesn't work. Morrison claims Nora was already involved when Bryce arrived at Memorial, But our evidence suggests the drug diversion at your hospital only began after Bryce was installed as administrator. Why would Morrison lie about this? Flynn wondered. Rebecca's expression darkened. I have a theory. By portraying Nora as a long-term co-conspirator, Morrison diminishes his son's culpability. It becomes a story of Bryce being manipulated by an already corrupt nurse rather than Bryce establishing the diversion scheme himself. He's trying to protect his son, Flynn realized. Even now, and possibly secure better terms for himself by offering a wider conspiracy than actually existed, Rebecca added. Prosecutors value information that expands their case to new targets. Flynn studied the documents, a new possibility forming. If Morrison is lying about Nora's initial recruitment, what else might he be fabricating? That's what bothers me, Rebecca admitted. I've been tracking Morrison's operations for years. Their typical pattern involves administrator-level corruption first, then pressuring or bribing medical staff with direct access to controlled substances. They don't usually recruit the medical staff first. Flynn's mind raced, revisiting the entire narrative. Could Nora have been telling the truth about being manipulated by Madigan? About not realizing the extent of the diversion until it was too late? It's possible, Rebecca acknowledged cautiously, though she still participated in framing your son, which is inexcusable regardless. Flynn agreed, but found himself unsettled by this new uncertainty. Had he perhaps been too quick to believe the worst about Nora? Had his anger over Liam's arrest blinded him to nuances in her involvement? These questions continued to trouble him as he prepared to meet with Danielle to discuss potential legal implications of Morrison's claims. If Morrison's statements about Nora prove false, Danielle noted after reviewing Rebecca's information, it could impact her sentencing, especially if she's being offered a deal for cooperation based on knowledge she doesn't actually possess. Should we intervene? Flynn asked. Danielle seemed surprised. You would advocate for your ex-wife after what she did? Flynn struggled to articulate his conflicted feelings. I want the truth, whatever it is. If Nora was less involved than Morrison claims, the sentence should reflect that. If she was more involved, likewise. Justice rather than vengeance, Danielle observed. Admirable, though many in your position would feel differently. Flynn decided to visit Nora directly for the first time since her sentencing. The women's correctional facility was a stark concrete structure on Phoenix's outskirts. After passing through security, Flynn was led to a visitation room where Nora waited, startled by his unexpected appearance. Prison had changed her physically. Her copper hair dulled, her face thinner, the confident posture diminished. Yet her amber eyes remained alert, studying Flynn with a mixture of wariness and hope. Flynn, she said when he sat across from her, I didn't expect to ever see you here. Neither did I, he admitted. But some new information has emerged that I need to clarify directly. He explained Morrison's claims about her early recruitment and Rebecca's contradictory evidence. He's lying, Nora said immediately. I never had any arrangement with Morrison before Bryce came to Memorial. Yes, my brother had financial troubles, but they were resolved through insurance, not some criminal payoff. When did your involvement actually begin? Flynn asked directly. Nora's gaze dropped to the table. About 8 months before the accident. Bryce and I were already involved romantically when he first mentioned inventory adjustments. He presented it as standard practice, shifting supplies between departments to address shortages. And you believe that? At first, yes. Hospital inventory systems are notoriously imperfect. It seemed plausible. She looked up, meeting his eyes. By the time I realized what was really happening, that drugs were being diverted for sale, I was already implicated through my signatures on documentation. Why not report it then? I considered it, Nora claimed. But Bryce made it clear that I would be the one blamed if the scheme was exposed. He had heralded protection, I didn't. Flynn studied his ex-wife carefully, trying to discern truth from manipulation. And the plan to target Mrs. Keller? Nora's expression crumpled. That was panic, pure and simple. When we learned she was focusing on our department's records, Bryce became desperate. He suggested increasingly extreme measures. I never thought he'd actually follow through. But you discussed hitting her car, Flynn pressed, recalling the recorded conversations. I was stalling, Nora insisted. trying to find a way out that wouldn't destroy my career or land me in prison. Then the accident happened while we were both intoxicated and everything accelerated. And framing Liam? Was that panic too? Tears filled Nora's eyes. It was the worst mistake of my life. Bryce suggested it in the moment, said Liam would get probation at most because of his age and clean record. I was terrified and not thinking clearly. Flynn sat back, processing her version of events. It aligned more closely with Rebecca's assessment of Morrison's typical operation than with Harold's claims about Nora's early recruitment. "Why should I believe you now?" Flynn asked. "You've lied repeatedly. To me, to the police, to the court. I have no reason to lie anymore," Nora replied simply. "I've lost everything that mattered. My marriage, my son, my career, my freedom. The truth is all I have left." After leaving the prison, Flynn contacted Detective Michaels to share Nora's account. "It's consistent with what we're finding as we dig deeper," Michaels confirmed. "Morrison appears to be exaggerating Nora's role while minimizing his and his son's culpability. Will this affect her sentence?" Flynn asked. "Potentially, if she cooperates with our investigation into Morrison's larger operation, providing verifiable information about Bryce's activities, the prosecutor might consider a recommendation for reduced time." Flynn felt strangely conflicted. While Nora deserved punishment for her actions, particularly framing Liam, the possibility that she had been less culpable than initially believed complicated his sense of justice being served. That evening, he had a difficult conversation with Liam, explaining the new developments. "So Mom wasn't some criminal mastermind," Liam summarized after Flynn finished. "Just someone who got in too deep and made terrible choices to protect herself." "That's what the evidence suggests," Flynn confirmed, "though it doesn't excuse what she did to you." Liam sat quietly, processing this shift in narrative. "I think I want to see her," he said finally. "Not to forgive her. I'm not ready for that, but to understand better." "Are you sure?" Flynn asked. "You don't owe her anything." "I know," Liam acknowledged, "but I think I owe it to myself to hear her explanation directly. Otherwise, this will always be an unfinished chapter." Flynn nodded, struck by his son's emotional maturity. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." The following week brought another unexpected development. Harold Morrison, facing mounting evidence contradicting his claims about Nora, recanted portions of his testimony, admitting he had misremembered certain recruitment details. This reversal triggered a review of Nora's case. While her guilt regarding the false police report and involvement in the crash cover-up remained uncontested, her role in the larger drug diversion scheme was reassessed. Flynn found himself in the unusual position of providing a statement to the review board, clarifying that while he supported appropriate punishment for Nora's crimes against Liam, he believed that sentence should be based on accurate information about her overall involvement. 2 months later, Nora's sentence was adjusted, reduced from 5 years to 3, with eligibility for parole after serving 18 months. The court cited her cooperation in the expanded investigation and clarification of her actual role in the scheme. Flynn's measured response to these developments surprised those who expected continued vengeance. But through the rebuilding of his and Liam's lives, Flynn had come to recognize that true justice required precision, not maximalist punishment. Just as his architectural restorations demanded careful assessment of which elements could be salvaged and which required replacement, addressing Nora's betrayal called for nuanced evaluation rather than wholesale condemnation. This understanding didn't diminish the pain of her actions or suggest reconciliation was possible. Some damage couldn't be repaired, but it did allow Flynn and Liam to begin defining their future without being consumed by the past, the first step in genuine reconstruction. Chapter 9. The Resolution. 2 years after the security camera notification that had triggered the collapse of Flynn's family, he stood in his restored Hawthorne Theater, surveying the gleaming Art Deco details his team had painstakingly recreated. The building had just won a National Preservation Award, bringing prestige and new clients to Cornerstone Restoration and Engineering. His phone vibrated with a text from Liam. "Just got my acceptance letter from NYU. Drama program said my application was exceptionally compelling. Guess some good came from all the real-life drama." Flynn smiled at his son's resilience. Liam had transformed his traumatic experiences into powerful creative work, writing and directing a one-act play about truth and betrayal that had impressed university admissions committees. At 18, he was preparing to leave Phoenix, not fleeing painful memories, but pursuing genuine passion. Quite an achievement, came a voice behind him. Flynn turned to find Detective Michaels, now Captain Michaels, following her recent promotion. The theater or my son's college acceptance? Flynn asked. Both, she replied with a smile. Though I was referring to this place. You've given it new life. They walked through the theater's lobby, where workers were installing the final lighting fixtures. I've been meaning to update you, Michaels continued. The Morrison Pharmaceuticals case is officially closed. 7 executives convicted, including Harold, regulatory reforms implemented across the industry, and restitution paid to affected hospitals. Good, Flynn said simply. And Bryce Madigan denied parole last month. The board cited his continued refusal to fully acknowledge his role in the schemes. She hesitated. Your ex-wife has a hearing scheduled next week. The prosecutor isn't opposing her parole given her cooperation. Flynn nodded, unsurprised. In the years since Nora's sentence had been reduced, she had provided valuable testimony in multiple cases connected to the Morrison operation. Liam had visited her twice, difficult encounters that had nonetheless helped him process his feelings about her betrayal. Liam mentioned she might relocate to Colorado after release, Flynn noted. Her sister lives there. Fresh start, Michaels observed. Probably wise, given her history here. After Michaels departed, Flynn continued his inspection of the theater restoration. Each element, from the intricate ceiling medallions to the restored stage machinery, represented careful decisions about what could be salvaged and what needed replacement. The process mirrored Flynn's approach to rebuilding his life after Nora's betrayal, preserving what remained valuable while constructing new elements where necessary. That evening, Flynn hosted a small dinner at his condo to celebrate Liam's college acceptance. Bridget attended, along with Weston and his wife, and surprisingly, Mrs. Keller, who had become something of a mentor to Liam after her recovery from the trauma of the case. To new beginnings, Bridget toasted, raising her glass. And to my brilliant nephew who's going to take Broadway by storm. Liam blushed under the attention. I just want to study first. Maybe write some plays that matter. They already do, Mrs. Keller said warmly. Your one act about truth and consequences moved me deeply. As conversation flowed around the dinner table, Flynn observed the unlikely family they had formed from the wreckage of betrayal. Bridget, whose fierce protectiveness had provided stability during the worst moments. Weston, whose investigative resources had helped expose the truth. Mrs. Keller, whose courage in pursuing the pharmaceutical investigation had inadvertently triggered the entire chain of events. And Liam, his son who had emerged from trauma not bitter, but more empathetic and determined. Dad's the real hero, Liam said suddenly, interrupting Flynn's thoughts. When everyone else was lying, he never stopped fighting for the truth. Flynn shook his head. I just did what any father would do. No, Weston countered. Most people would have settled, taken the easier path. You refused to compromise. Later, after the guests had departed and Flynn was cleaning up, Liam joined him in the kitchen. I got another letter today, he said quietly. From Mom. Flynn paused, giving his son his full attention. What did she say? She's been approved for parole. Getting out next month. Liam leaned against the counter. She asked if I would consider seeing her before I leave for New York. Flynn carefully controlled his expression. How do you feel about that? Mixed, Liam admitted. Part of me still can't forgive her for what she did. But another part, I don't want to carry this anger forever, you know? Flynn nodded, understanding completely. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Would you come with me? Liam asked, vulnerability evident in his voice. Not to participate, just to be there afterward. Of course, Flynn replied without hesitation. Always. 3 weeks later, Flynn waited in his truck outside the coffee shop where Liam had arranged to meet Nora following her release. Through the window, he could see them sitting across from each other, Nora looking older, diminished somehow, while Liam sat straight-backed and composed. Flynn couldn't hear their conversation, but he observed their body language. Nora's pleading gestures, Liam's measured responses. There were no dramatic embraces or tearful reconciliations, just two people attempting to navigate the aftermath of irreparable damage. After 40 minutes, Liam emerged from the coffee shop alone, climbing into the passenger seat beside Flynn. "You okay?" Flynn asked. Liam stared straight ahead. She apologized, said all the right things about regret and making terrible choices. He paused. "She's moving to Denver next week to live with Aunt Caroline. Did that give you what you needed?" Liam considered the question thoughtfully. "I think so. Not closure exactly. I'm not sure that exists for something like this. But perspective." He turned to Flynn. "I told her I forgive her for what she did to me." Flynn raised an eyebrow in surprise. "That's generous." "Not really," Liam replied. "I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it for me." Carrying around anger and resentment was exhausting. "I'm ready to put it down." Flynn squeezed his son's shoulder, immensely proud of the young man he had become. "That's wisdom beyond your years." As they drove away, Flynn glanced in the rearview mirror. Nora stood outside the coffee shop, watching them leave, a ghostly reminder of the life they had once shared. But unlike 2 years ago, when the security camera had revealed her betrayal, Flynn felt no rage, no burning desire for vengeance. Only a quiet certainty that they had emerged from the ordeal stronger than before. The following month brought Liam's high school graduation and preparations for his move to New York. Flynn threw himself into restoration projects, including a historic courthouse in Tucson that would keep him traveling regularly for the next year. "You're not staying busy just to avoid an empty nest, are you?" Bridget teased during a family dinner. Flynn smiled. "Maybe partly, but I've also discovered something important through all this." "What's that?" "That restoration isn't just about buildings." Flynn looked at Liam across the table. "It's about recognizing what's worth preserving, having the courage to remove what's damaged beyond repair, and building something new when necessary. Sometimes the result isn't what you originally envisioned, but it has an integrity all its own." On the August morning, when Flynn drove Liam to the airport for his flight to New York, they took a detour past the Hawthorne Theater. Standing before its gleaming facade in the early desert light, Flynn felt a sense of completion. "We should take a picture," Liam suggested. "Your two greatest achievements, saving this place and getting me to adulthood in one piece." Flynn laughed. The theater was definitely easier. As they stood together for the photo, Flynn marveled at how differently things might have unfolded had he ignored his instincts that day in the hospital, had he not believed in his son's innocence or pursued the truth so relentlessly. "Dad," Liam said as they resumed their drive to the airport, "I've been thinking about something Mrs. Keller said at dinner last month, about how the worst betrayals sometimes lead to unexpected gifts." "Oh," Flynn prompted. "I think she was right. If Mom hadn't done what she did, you and I might never have become as close as we are now. I might never have found my voice as a writer." Liam looked out at the Phoenix landscape slipping past. "I'm not grateful it happened, but I'm grateful for what we built from it." Flynn considered his son's words. That's the essence of restoration work, finding value in what remains after damage occurs. At the airport terminal, their goodbye was quick but emotional. Liam, eager to begin his new chapter, promised to call regularly. Flynn, both proud and wistful, assured his son that Phoenix would always be home whenever he needed it. As Flynn watched Liam disappear into the security checkpoint, his phone chimed with a text from Detective Michaels. "Found these in the evidence archives. Thought you might want them." Attached was a photo of the original security camera footage, stills, the images that had started everything. Flynn studied them briefly, then deleted the message. Those images had served their purpose. They had revealed a painful truth, triggered a necessary demolition, and ultimately enabled reconstruction. But they no longer defined his story. Driving back through the sun-drenched streets of Phoenix, Flynn considered his next project, a historic fire station in desperate need of rehabilitation. Like him, it had weathered damage but remained structurally sound. With proper care and expertise, its original character could be preserved while adapting to a new purpose. Flynn smiled at the symmetry. The security camera notification that had appeared on his phone that fateful night had initiated not just an ending, but also a beginning. The foundation had been tested, found flawed, and rebuilt stronger. The work of restoration, both personal and professional, continued. And in that continuous process of evaluation, preservation, and renewal, Flynn had discovered not just resilience, but genuine transformation. The man who had once defined himself primarily through his marriage and career now recognized his capacity to withstand betrayal, fight for justice, and forge new connections from the remnants of what was lost. As he pulled into the parking lot of his office building, Flynn's phone rang. A potential client interested in restoring a historic ranch house north of Sedona. He answered with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that authentic restoration wasn't about returning to what once was, but about honoring what endured while embracing what could be. The journey from devastation to reconstruction had taught him that some structures, whether physical buildings or human relationships, couldn't be saved in their original form. But with proper care and honest assessment, something meaningful could always be built from what remained. It was a lesson worth every painful step of the journey. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.